Tünaydın. That's all I know. My name is Simon. I am a metallurgical engineer, a software developer, a project manager, and now in this life, I am an enterprise agile coach. So today, we're going to be speaking about, oh, or maybe we won't. There we go. We're going to be speaking about applying Scrum and Agility to engineering, procurement, construction, management projects. In particular, my experience with 3 $800 billion gas plants. So first of all, let's talk about the problem. In 2017, McKinsey Consulting put out a report saying that in 274 mega projects globally, mega project being anything over $1 billion, that the industry did not have a very good record with cost overruns and schedule overruns. And in particular, for oil and gas upstream, as you can see, the numbers are somewhere about 34% over in budget, 41% over in schedule. Not very good for the project management industry. So that's what we're going to talk about today, how we experimented using Scrum to make that better. So here's what we're going to talk about. I'll give you a little background on gas plants. We'll talk a little bit about EPCM. We'll talk much more about what Scrum is, and specifically Scrum Values, because this is what makes the difference when you're applying Scrum to anything. We'll talk a little bit about organizational culture and how that comes into play. I'll give you an idea of what the results were of this program that took about 4 years to complete. And then my thoughts around what is necessary to apply this to other projects. So first of all, what's a gas plant? Well, it's a very large facility that processes natural gas. What does that mean? It takes feedstock from surrounding wells, gas wells, and it removes water, any other impurities, sulfur, hydrocarbons, so that it can be used in all parts of the world. These particular plants, 400 million cubic feet a day. How much is that? That's the Titanic with an Airbus A360, so it's that volume times 5 every day. So these are very large things. Originally estimated each of these gas plants would cost $800 million US. So EPCM, engineering, procurement, construction, management. The owner had experience already building their own gas plant using EPC. In this case, they wanted to hire a firm that would do all of the engineering, procurement, and construction, and the management of that. So this was a bit of a change for the owner because it meant going from actual execution of the project themselves to oversight of someone else doing it, okay? As far as concurrent activities go, the idea here, of course, is that we do enough engineering to start procurement, and then we do enough procurement so we can get started on construction. Part of the complications here is we had 3 gas plants that were staggered, so we had many concurrent activities at the same time. And then finally, initially, it was thought that we would be using what's called a design one, build many, meaning that we would try to use as many reusable components from these gas plants to minimize changes in design. Now, the sheer size of these gas plants, the number of people involved, the number of activities, the number of components means there's an awful lot of complexity. And by complexity, What I mean is there are many things, so many things, that interact with each other, that they do so in not very predictable ways. That's what complexity is. And of course, that means that complexity involves a lot of unknown change. We don't know how a change here is necessarily going to affect something over here. Now, that change, every time there is a change, there's a cost of delay. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is when something changes, it takes a lot of time for organizations, people, to accommodate that change. And that time costs money. So what we've discovered, of course, is that those costs of delay are amplified whenever you have a situation where you have unclear goals, where you have invisible progress, where you have impediments that are invisible, silos, communication gaps, and unfortunately, where you have blame and lack of ownership, in other words, siloed organizations. If you experience any of those things, then the cost of delay is going to increase, okay? So, I was speaking with the project or the program sponsor over a number of months. And he and I would have conversations, and at the time, I was coaching a lot of software teams using Scrum. He and I would talk. He would tell me about these problems. He would tell me about the lack of tangible progress, the lack of clear goals, the lack of clarity on roles. And I would tell him, well, when we have these problems in software teams, here's how we try to solve those. And in my case, it's using Scrum. So he decided that we would try and run an experiment. It turned into a very long experiment that became quite successful. But the idea here was that we've seen these problems with teams in other industries. Why not apply in this industry? Because it's always about the team. This is always about people. Agility is about our ability to quickly respond to change. And as I said earlier, really the big problem on these projects is not the construction part. We've been building things for a very long time. We know how to do that. But what takes an awful lot of time is when anything changes, and the bigger the project, the more unknown those changes are. So, agility is about embracing change and about reducing the cost of change. Because we know change is coming, so let's work in a way that assumes change is coming. And Scrum is an agility framework that is specifically used for solving complex problems through inspection and adaptation. So we thought it was a good fit. And this is the core concepts in Scrum. Transparency, inspection, and adaptation. The transparency meaning that significant aspects of the work and the process used for the work needs to be visible to everybody so that we can see where we are. If we can see our progress, if we can see the things that are getting in our way, it allows us to look at that, assess it, and adapt when things aren't going the way we want them to. So here is the basic mechanics of Scrum. It starts with what we call a product backlog, which is really just a list of issues, a list of things that are important to the project or the program. The important thing here is that it is prioritized from top to bottom so that we always are working on the most important thing for the project or the program at any given time. And we select a few things from that list, and we go through what we call a sprint planning session, where we look at those top 2 or 3 problems, and we figure out as a team, how are we going to address those problems? And we spend the next 2 weeks working this plan. We get together every day for a brief meeting to update each other on progress towards reaching our goal for the 2-week sprint and any impediments that are getting in our way. And at the end of that 2-week period, we have useful solutions to those problems. So 2 other things then happen. One is that we have a look at those solutions to the problems, and we see how that has affected what we think is the next most important thing is to work on for this program. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, we do this thing called a sprint retrospective. And that is the chance for the team, this multidiscipline group of people, to get together to talk specifically not so much about what they're building, but how they're building it. How are they communicating? How are they working together? Because as I said, so many of these problems on any project, software, manufacturing, construction, it's not about the domain, it's about us. It's about how we work together. So, I want to spend a bit of time here talking about Scrum values. There's 5 of them, and they're interlocking and they build off one another. We have commitment, openness, respect, courage, and focus. And it's really important that the team members embody these values. And so we're going to go through a few examples. Did I knock my mic? We're going to go through a few examples of these values. Focus. Ruthless prioritization of issues. What that means is we can't have 3 number 1 priorities. No. You have to have 1 number 1 priority and a number 2 priority. Because what we're always trying to do is work on the most valuable thing for the project or the program. And we minimize our work in progress. When we started this, the project sponsor said, you know, we have this list of 20 things, and week after week, those 20 things never get done. They get a little bit of progress, but nothing's done. The reason is because you need to take those 20 things, decide what's most important, and do several of them, just a few of them, get them done and move on to the next most important thing. Courage. So I mentioned a retrospective, and what that really is a chance for the team members to talk about the things that are working well and to talk about the things that aren't working well. That takes courage. We have to speak with our team members, the people that we work with, in an honest way and in a way that's not threatening about the things that aren't working. That can be very difficult for some people, but it's necessary. If we don't bring these subjects up and discuss them, they won't change. So it takes a lot of courage to do that. Hello, there we go. Openness. This is an example of a situation room, and this is a situation where we have the work that the team has agreed to do and the plan to accomplish the goals laid out on the wall for everybody on the team to see. This is also very difficult for some people to do. Lots of people are very comfortable working by themselves or not necessarily having other people know what they're working on. This means that everyone has an understanding of who's working on what. and respect. We have to respect each other. And we have to respect how we work together. This is an example of the output of a team having a conversation about working agreements. How are we going to work together? How are we going to communicate? Are we going to use email? If we're going to use email, what sort of timing should we expect on that? Do we prefer face-to-face communication? All sorts of things about how can we get better at working and communicating and collaborating as a team. And then commitment. One example of that is we're much more interested in committing to goals and outcomes rather than particular solutions. We know that we're not going to know all the answers up front. We know that we're not going to know all the problems up front. When we start to identify them as a team, we want to commit to each other that we're looking at solving a problem, not necessarily a particular solution. We need to commit to each other to help each other. And we need very, very often to commit to challenging the status quo, which means this is how we used to do things, or this is how we have done things. Maybe that hasn't worked great in the past. Let's change that. So I wanted to point out here that we didn't replace the project management system with Scrum. We did not replace it. What we did was we added it to the existing project management system. So traditionally, there's an updated integrated schedule that produces a 12-week look ahead and a 3-week look ahead, and then there's a weekly review of those things. That didn't stop. But what we did do was add the Scrum framework in between all of those checkpoints so that we had a sprint plan that had inputs that weren't necessarily from the schedule. A lot of these inputs don't show up on the schedule. And it's really, really important that those things are well understood by the team. So I just want you to understand that we are not replacing the existing project management, we are adding to it with this system. So let's talk a little bit about culture. In this situation, we had an owner and the EPCM, and they had different work cultures. It was apparent in the way they held meetings, it was apparent in the way they communicated, they were different. So we took some time to try and figure out what are the differences between the cultures. We used a competing values framework to just sort of map out where we thought the two organizations were. Once we realized we had a way to see that, we wanted to do something about it, because if you have two competing cultures, collaboration and communication is difficult. Of course, rather than trying to shift one company's culture to the other, we didn't do that. That's not going to work very often. We wanted to help create a culture for the program. And to do that, we used some work by Patrick Lencioni. He wrote about it in his book called The Advantage. And in it, he discusses the importance of shared vision, shared mission, and a set of shared values for any team to function. And so we spent quite a bit of time with the two companies coming up with the vision and the mission for this program, and then a set of values, and more importantly, a set of behaviors that we could talk about that were going to tell us if we were off track as a group. So that was at a very high level. Once we started working on the program, the other thing that became very obvious was that people had very often the wrong expectation about how their role related to the other roles in the organization. That was even amplified more by the fact that these were two separate companies. So we spent a lot of time making sure that there was role alignment amongst the team members. Then what we had to do was we had to actually have the EPCM company believe that Scrum, the Scrum values and the Scrum principles, as well as this other thing called the breakthrough model, which I will get to in a second, were valuable. Because as the owner in oversight, that did not matter. What mattered was that the EPCM, the people that were doing the work, needed to understand that this could be valuable. It took some time and it took some trust, but it did happen. So let's talk a little bit about that. This breakthrough model, has anyone ever heard of this? Anyone? No? Okay. So a breakdown, this thing called a breakdown, is a forward-looking situation where what is predictable, in other words, what you think is going to happen, is not going to be satisfactory. You look ahead in the schedule and you say, we need these 400 drawings by next month. Historically, we've been doing 50 a month. How is that going to happen? That's a breakdown. The team is happy about finding breakdowns because it means that they are exposing things, exposing problems that need to be solved. Those are the things that ended up going on the product backlog. Those are the things that were important to the success of the project. What that involved, the solutions to these problems involved always challenging the status quo. Always about, this is the way we have been doing this. It's predictable that if we don't change something significant, we are not going to be able to meet our goals. So we must change. We must think outside of the box and change how we view the work. As far as communication overall goes, we used a Scrum of Scrums approach, which essentially means if you have a Scrum team, if you have a group of multidisciplined people who are responsible for solving a problem, and that team is one of several teams, and you're all working towards a common goal, in order to facilitate coordination, somebody from each of those teams needs to get together on a regular basis and talk about the impediments that are getting in each other's ways. So we took the same approach. We then were able to apply lessons learned from sprint to sprint to sprint across multiple projects. Very, very helpful for us. We used this concept called the 24-hour rule. When a problem came up on a team, you identified it, you had 24 hours to figure out how to solve it yourself. If you could not solve it yourself, you had to bring it up to the team so that the team as a whole could take it on. More brains, more quickly solved. One of the things we learned was that having co-location, having people together, face-to-face communication, old school writing on the wall, index cards is still, believe it or not, the best way to communicate. Of course, we ended up having not co-located teams and using Excel and using screen sharing and using phones, and it works fine, but it's still not quite as good. So, let's get back to this. 34% cost overrun and 41% schedule overrun. In our case, not 100% due to Scrum, of course, but we did exceed that. We had 3 plants built over a period of 4 years. The first one, 38 days early and under budget. The second one, 86 days early. and the third one almost 4 months early. All of them under budget. And the project sponsor and the program sponsor put that down for the most part due to alignment on the goals and the communication mechanisms that we used that reduced the cost of delay. So, what do you need to do to make this successful? Well, what you need to give up is you need to give up thinking that you know all the answers up front. And in fact, you need to give up thinking that you know all the questions up front. Because this is all about change. And if you can assume that change is going to happen and you work in a way that incorporates change, you're going to get these kinds of results. So I'm going to leave you with this. I was reading a book called Sapiens, written by Harari, and I think what I'm taking from it is that I believe that in the project management field, that we are coming across a revolution, similar to the scientific revolution. The quote here, the great discovery that launched the scientific revolution was the discovery that we do not know all the answers to the important questions. I think that's the same thing that's happening in project management right now, that it's okay not to know all the answers, that it's okay not to know all the questions. And it's by using tools, empirical tools like Scrum, the scientific method, that we then get to learn the answers, but we learn them when we need them. We don't need them all up front. Teşekkür. Thank you.
We would like to present you a plaque. Sayın ORRELL'a teşekkür ediyoruz. Plaket takdimi için Sayın Yönetim Kurulu Başkanımız İlke Bozkurt'u sahneye davet ediyorum.
Thank you. Thank you.